Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another BIC Streams event around climate smart cities. Before I start, the usual housekeeping announcements for those in the room. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see a chat box. So if you could kindly click on the chat box, that is something that will bring up the chat box, and it's a space that we will be using to put out the bios of our speakers today. Another box that you will see below is the Q&A box. You can ask questions by typing them in the Q&A box. We also have people on the YouTube channel, and for those, the Q&A will not be visible to them. So we will be reading out the questions from time to time so that the people on the YouTube channel can also hear them. So once again, welcome to today's session on climate smart cities, building resilience. I'd like to welcome our panelists today, Anu Jogesh, Ankit Bardwaj, Prem Chandavarkar, Ashwin Mahesh, and Rajiv Gowda. Thank you all for being on the panel today. I would also like to call out Jenny Pinto, who is a program committee member, who has spent a lot of time. She's putting together an entire series around the climate change issue. And the first one under that series was A Decent Living for All with Professor Narasimha. This is the second under the same session. Now, before we start, I actually want to run a small poll. So I'm just bringing up the poll for people in the room. So if you could respond to this poll, please. You will see it on your screen. There are 3 questions. And if you can respond to these 3 questions, please. The responses have started coming in. Could we just have everyone respond, please? We have about 35% of the responses have come in, just waiting for the rest to, we are halfway there, another 10 seconds for the rest to respond. Okay, so I'm now ending the polling and sharing the results with the people in the room. And for those on the YouTube call, I'm just going to read out the question and the answer. The first question is, have you heard of the Keeling curve? And we have about almost 88% of the people haven't heard of the Keeling curve. And I'm sure our panelists will tell us what the Keeling curve is. It gives us a sense in terms of the awareness of the kind of demographics that we have attracted for this session. And this makes me glad that over 88% don't know what the Keeling curve is. Yes is about 9%. And well, somebody thinks it's Christine Keeler, possibly. Do policymakers and planners think of climate mitigation, adaptation, resilience at all in the context of cities? Yes, all the time is just 5%. The bulk is sometimes 58%. No is 37%. The last question was, will COVID-19 change the way we address city living that incorporates climate resilience features? 65% of the group is optimistic that COVID-19 will change the way we think about cities, and that's very heartening to know, and consequently build in the climate resilience features. 23% say no, and 12% are questioning as to what we are smoking when we ask this question. So that's a poll that gives our panelists a sense of what the views of the group is. Now, in this entire series, actually, if you see what we have been doing over the last 45, 50 days at BIC since we went into the lockdown, both in our podcast as well as in our BIC streams, we have been doing events where we have been looking at the issue through the prism of COVID-19. Will COVID-19 change the way we look at the way we do things? Will we go back to business as usual? Will it be different? So if you look at COVID-19, to me, there have been two visible signs. Just about everybody is wearing a mask if you do see them. And the other visible sign is we have had clean air, clean water in our lakes and the like, all the good things that, so it is now almost, there is evidence that if we stayed out of the way, nature has a way of healing itself. There has been the invisible issues, particularly invisible, which became visible on the migrant issue in terms of what does it do, the inequality that we have, and what does it do for people who don't have shelter over their heads or are at some distance from their homes. That's another thing that this has made quite apparent. You know, yesterday in another panel, Manish Sabharwal used a phrase. He said that we are all in the same storm, but we are not in the same boat. There is another looming storm, which is climate change. And clearly we may need to build a much bigger ship, a kind of a Noah Ark plus when the climate change storm hits us at a later date. Now, for those who are in the field, the terms like, which I use even in the question, mitigation, adaptation, resilience, climate justice, etc., are commonly thrown about. But as we saw in this particular group, people really want to understand what is this whole climate change thing about and why is it that we should worry about it. And that's something that our panel will be addressing. We will be talking about the various sectors in city living. So whether it be energy, whether it be water, housing, waste, food, built form, mobility, a range of these issues in terms of city living, we will be talking about it and what can climate change, what is the impact of climate change on many of these parameters. So the focus will really be, we start with what is the potential impact of climate change. The experts will give us a sense of what is it that we can do. And more importantly, how do we get the things that we need to do? How do we get there? So initially, I'd like to start this session by calling Anu. Now, Anu has a whole lot of experience in climate change policy and governance. And Anu, I'd like to ask you a question. And if you could unmute yourself, really walk us through the potential impact. One reads that there could be flooding, there will be heat islands, there will be crop failures and the like. Make it come alive for us in terms of what could be the potential impact of climate change. And you've always made this point that climate change does not sit in isolation. And you've been exploring what could be the entry points for transformational change. So give us a sense of the impact and how you see this particular issue, Anu. Over to you, Anu.
Thanks, Ravi. And thanks for that introduction. And I'm glad you said paint a picture, because I think I'm going to start with an anecdote. So thanks, everyone, and thanks for inviting me. For me, a story that recently really captured the narrative of climate vulnerability in cities is, in fact, this Oscar-winning movie, Parasite. I don't know how many of you have actually seen it. So without giving any spoilers, it's about two families based in the city Seoul in Korea that are not just divided by social class, but by topography. And it's a fantastic example of how you've been a single day of extremely heavy rainfall, and both class and geography basically determine and shape how particular families face that risk. But you have the poor family basically seeing extreme flooding in their low elevation area that they stay, and they are sort of temporarily displaced. When you think about class and geography, these are two components that are actually critical drivers and a combination of factors that impact many cities when you think about climate change. And Indian cities are actually not that different. If you look at urban India, let's just list out some of the key climate-linked threats. I think flooding is arguably the most recurrent one. There was an interesting study that was done recently about 46 cities with about 1 million plus population. 50% of them saw flooding as their sort of key climate risk. And then going away from flooding, you have a high degree of projected mortality and morbidity, some of which you're already seeing with increased heat stress. When you go into, sort of not just heavy and erratic precipitation, what you end up with is also uneven water supply, and in some places scarcity. And in coastal cities, whether it's Kolkata or Mumbai, increased incidences of storm surges and certainly cyclonic activity. In fact, if you look at floods and cyclones, they have together over the last 2 decades in India overtaken droughts as being the 2 biggest weather-related sort of losses that India actually sees. And this is expected to actually grow because you're finally starting to see numbers, economic numbers, to how some of these disasters are impacting the country, and certainly in urban India as well. Now, these in turn have sort of a cascading impact on sort of other areas. So you see a greater incidence of waterborne and vector-borne diseases like dengue, pressure on energy systems because there's a greater demand for cooling, and critically, because of the impact on agriculture in rural and peri-urban India, sort of impacts on food prices, food price fluctuations, and potentially food security for urban India. And so what you see is climate change is fundamentally and deeply interconnected in terms of system interdependencies. And Indian cities are precariously poised to sort of address these for a couple of reasons. And I will just touch upon a few because I know we'll get into this in further detail during the discussion. One, there's a high degree of social inequality. We already know that. You have a large, sizable population that has limited or no access to basic services, whether it's piped water, whether it's adequate drainage, whether it's toilets. You also have a good degree of the population in informal settlements that also live in vulnerable locations, very much that parasite example again. And you see that in Indian cities as well, living on floodplains, living in dense agglomerations that are also more at the sort of end where it will get impacted more. The second is that we have had big infrastructure investment over the last 2 decades, whether it's telecom, energy, water infrastructure. But if you think about critical infrastructure, when you use the word critical lifeline services to urban residents. This infrastructure is actually been built to withstand the kind of climate projections we are now talking about, both in terms of their structural durability and the continuity of their service provision. The third, we're seeing a massive degradation in the urban environment. Or urban natural environment rather, both in surface and groundwater systems, in terms of the quality of urban forests. And we've always known this, but there's now a big sort of global literature that's congregating on this idea of natural infrastructure and what it does in terms of urban drainage, in terms of acting as windbreakers, biodefenses for storm surges, heat protection, and these are getting degraded. And finally, the point that's actually linked to social inequality is the fact that we do have a migrant population, and Ravi, you really did touch upon that. We have an informal economy, we have a migrant population, and they're really the first to get impacted when there's an urban disruption. And the COVID outbreak has sort of put that in the forefront quite starkly. And now, staying with that COVID conversation, I think what it's really shown us is the challenges and the implications of failing to deal with what is fundamentally a systemic risk. And climate change is a systemic risk. And systemic actually mean? We have been tackling climate change explicitly in cities, and without getting into examples, because I know we'll do that during the course of this discussion, has been in a fragmented manner. There've been some interesting pockets of innovation, pockets of interesting work that's been done in cities across India through various drivers. But one of the reasons, one of the things we're seeing is that they are isolated projects. So they are sort of slowly, incrementally hacking away at a system. There are very few instances where you've had sort of institutional mechanism that's been put in place to deal with climate change consistently in cities. Now, before I end, I just want to say, when you think about urban change, a couple of things come out again and again. When you think about climate impacts, one, you have India's rapidly urbanizing, so you have this component of built infrastructure that you can still sort of use as an entry point to make structural changes. And two, this conversation about an institutional overhaul, because this is something that's coming up again and again with COVID as well. Institutional overhaul or a transformational change. I mean, I'd like to just place that what we see in a lot of the work that we actually do is that, yes, The former is very much a structural change, but non-structural changes are critical to building city resilience as well. And what are non-structural changes? Essentially in operations and maintenance, in demand and supply, in managing governance. But what you have in cities, even second tier and third tier cities, is you have multiple implementing agencies, you have sort of fractured governance mechanisms, and you have limited financial agencies. So I'd like to end here and I just put it out there. We're thinking about structural changes, but you have this system, and climate impacts, physical climate impacts, are really a threat multiplier, and they sit on all of this. And I'm there.
Thank you, Anu. So essentially, and we will come back to some of the issues, but you said the first issue is really flooding. So if I'm a landlocked place, would it mean that I have less concerns as far as flooding is concerned? Or does urban flooding, in terms of like Bangalore has seen urban flooding in certain areas because of stormwater drain design and badly designed and the like, would that also qualify as an urban, as a local flooding issue in landlocked areas due to climate change?
Yes. I think, when we typically look at flooding, you look at riverine flooding, you look at coastal flooding, and something very interesting, fluvial flooding, which is surface water flooding. You're right, we have poor urban drainage systems. We have infrastructure that's simply not equipped. So it actually doesn't matter if you're by the coast. Often you see it, in sort of systems near rivers. But also, if you're in a city like Bangalore, where you've just concretized a lot of your lakes and your tanks, that's also sort of a disaster waiting to happen. We're already seeing this. In cities like Guwahati, it's par for the course. It floods every year. So it's both system design and climate change.
Okay. Thanks, Anu. And the other point that you really mentioned about built infrastructure, and you use the word tier 2 and tier 3 cities, this is a good time for me to get in Ankit Bardwaj into the conversation. Ankit is based in New York, and he has done a lot of work on climate change policy. He has done a lot of research on climate change and Indian cities. So Ankit, before I get you in here, the question I'd like to pose to you, and I think you have some anecdotal field work that you have done in tier 2 cities. So share with us in terms of, because there is this thing that tier 1 cities are like Bangalore and Bombay and Chennai are too far gone. It's difficult to fix that. While we can go out and do something about tier 2 and tier 3, where you have done some work. So can you walk us through in terms of what is it that you have noticed in cities, particularly in the tier 2 and tier 3 cities? And you also have a certain expertise in understanding energy and climate change. So give us a sense of how we can get some of these things done right in our smaller cities, and your perspective on energy and climate change. Ankit?
Wonderful. Thank you, Ravi, and Jenny and others at Bangalore International Center for organizing such an esteemed panel. I'm really honored to be on it. And firstly, I just hope everyone in the audience and the panelists and their loved ones are taking care in these uncertain times. These are really difficult times, and I'm glad that we can come together and still have some interesting conversations together. As Ravi mentioned, I had been doing fieldwork in India for the last 3 years. And really my motivation was often to get away from the dialogues we were having in places like Bangalore and Delhi. I think that megacities provide a certain conundrum when it comes to climate change and urbanization that is not reflective of the reality of most urban Indians that live in tier 2 and tier 3 cities. And really, when I came out there, I was a young, naive researcher. I probably still am. And the goal was to perhaps, share what the best lessons were with these bureaucrats working in tier 2 and tier 3 cities. What I actually found was that climate change had already in some small ways started infiltrating their decision-making. Before I reflect on that, when it comes to addressing climate change, I think the menu of options that we have on the table are actually quite clear, right? The first thing we have to do is transition our energy system to low carbon sources. So that's including renewables like solar energy and wind. When it comes to our cities, it's creating buildings that use less energy. It's using more public transportation. It's creating housing that is more affordable for people so that they can live closer to their workplaces, so they have to use less carbon emissions to travel there, right? As you can see, these are issues that are obviously intersecting with issues of equity, as Anu rightfully pointed out, and are often needed in the response to the kind of justice crisis we have in terms of the migrants at the current moment. Often though, experts like me who are kind of studying the governance of these things think we kind of need to reinvent the governance system, right? We keep saying that the Indian city governance system is broken, that we need more local city democracy, right? I tend to agree with these things, right? I think we need to incorporate more planners and experts into our planning making. We need to have more local city councils, right? To follow up our honorable Prime Minister, it's not just about being vocal for our local, but for being able to vote for our local as well, right? So, but that said, when I was traveling in these three cities, I found that these kinds of changes of overhauling the governance system, creating new urban democracies was a very difficult task. And the fact of the matter is, the IPCC, which is the kind of international body of experts, have noted that we only have about 12 years to figure out how to reduce carbon emissions globally. And now the case is true that India and other developing countries have less of a burden, but I would highlight that India can actually gain a lot of opportunities from moving towards low carbon energy systems. So what exactly were these cities doing? This is what confused me. You know, they really didn't have much incentive to respond to climate change. They didn't have any more financial resources that they were getting. So how were they figuring out ways to respond to climate change? And the way that that I identified, along with the other actors in the space, is that instead of thinking of climate change as a new thing to do, instead of thinking of climate change as an additional burden for political actors and bureaucrats in the city, often these actors were aligning their already existing actions with addressing climate change, right? They were finding local interests that could benefit from addressing climate change. One example of that perhaps you're familiar with if you're in Delhi is the idea of air pollution, right? You can very feasibly address the local issue of air pollution while also addressing the local issue of climate change. So one bureaucrat that I interviewed called this superimposition, and that's the kind of language I've been using on this, in the sense that bureaucrats tend to have certain things that they do, right? They implement certain schemes like Swachh Bharat, smart cities, all these various schemes that we heard of, and they think of creative ways to add climate change on top of that, right? This actually ended up being quite a clever way to think about the problem. Let me just give you a couple of anecdotes, as Ravi mentioned, right? So the first anecdote was about the smart cities mission. The smart cities mission includes some guidelines to include technologies such as solar panels, electric vehicles, certain small increment amounts of these things. Not as much as we need, but at least it's there. In the city of Davangere, which is just north of Bangalore, I noted that the municipal commissioner was working with the puffed rice producing district, which was often using a polluting fuel. And what they did was, in collaboration with the industry and the workers, they transformed this polluting industrial district into one that was low carbon using the smart city mission, right? The point was to use the opportunity of these centralized schemes that often come with the technocratic guise and adapt them towards local, equity issues and local production centers. Similarly, in Coimbatore, they took the smart city mission and actually adapted it to actually address the lake problem in the city. So as one knows, Coimbatore's lakes are deeply polluted. They're deeply affected by the lack of water flow that's coming in from the Nilgiris. The smart city mission was actually used as a creative way to think about how to rejuvenate the city's lakes. This was done in conjunction with the local civil society, right? Lastly, an example from the city of Rajkot. There, a very clever engineer was working on developing affordable housing for all as part of the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, but also the state affordable housing mission. And there, instead of just building the kind of standard concrete boxes that we often think of when it comes to affordable housing built by the government, the engineer was able to find ways to corral more money to add elements like rainwater harvesting, ventilation, shading, solar photovoltaics on the rooftops, or even cool roofs. Now, my point of this is that, I agree that these are slightly incremental projects, but the point is that it's a way of thinking, right? And the way of thinking is that we shouldn't think of climate change or reducing carbon emissions as an additional burden. Actually, it's a deep opportunity. It's an opportunity to actually create safer, healthier housing, safer, healthier, and more equitable cities, and better economies as well, right? So really what I want to signal is that, yes, the central government should be creating stronger signals in terms of providing guidelines so that housing in cities are more equitable, more low carbon. The fact that we should be focusing more on things like public transport and affordable housing in the center of our cities. These are critical issues, especially in the light of the current migrant crisis. But also the central government and other states actors need to provide space for local city actors to align, climate change with their own local interests. And that's how I think we should be able to go forward.
Thanks, Ankit. So Ankit, so essentially, I know you're an academic too now. So, from the specific, there's a general theory that you tend to evolve. So would it be right to say that generalized theory is more the plug-on kind of approach to get these things done, rather than enter saying, look, you got to design with climate change at the heart of your design, and let's talk that. What you seem to be saying, look, these houses are getting built. If for a very incremental or no cost, you can add the solar heater, let's get that done. So is that your main learning from those three cities?
Yes, wonderful. Thanks for summarizing it so well. The reason why I have that particular learning is often because experts like me come in and try and redesign the whole plan of the city, rather than thinking of the ways that the local opportunities that exist. So I agree with you. It's about finding what exactly is already happening in the city and finding ways to add climate change to that. Yes.
So that's a very interesting input. We next go to our next speaker. So Prem Chandavakar is both involved in architecture, urban planning. He's a deep thinker. He's also a blogger, and I recommend you to go and read his blogs. There's a particular blog which we're also there on our event page, which I request you to go and look at for really nuances about what we are discussing today. I just saw 3 headings there in that thing which just caught my attention, where he says the fractured city as a sponge, and housing as a verb. And Prem thinks long and hard about some of these issues, and particularly on issues of social inequity. He has some very interesting thoughts about how we need to address issues of social housing and the like. And to help us think in terms of what does it living in a city mean for all sections of society, with a focus on the poor and the underprivileged. Prem, could you give us a sense of these days, day before yesterday, there were 5 pillars on which we are building the future. When I spoke to you, you said you might have 8 pillars for the city. Over to you, Prem.
Well, what I'm going to do is briefly run through 7 dimensions of urban planning, which is the area I'll focus on, which affect climate smart cities, some directly and some indirectly, but all substantively. So number 1 is a land market that supports a master plan. And we have highly inefficient land markets ridden with bureaucratic opacity and corruption, which distort prices to the level that half the population falls below the threshold of affordability offered by the master plan. And they're forced into spaces outside the paradigm of planning, that is slums, unregulated layouts, and other forms of informal housing. Now, there's a huge issue of social justice and affordable housing that I don't have the time to go into, but when such a large segment is living outside the planning paradigm, it affects everybody, not just the poor. Because any efficient public service, whether it's electricity, water, traffic, public transit, drainage, requires a certain consistency of order and space, which does not happen when half the population lives outside the paradigm. So they're generally in low-lying areas, and which makes them not only vulnerable to flooding, but also in the way for an efficient drainage backbone of the city. Because of problems like this, electricity and water operate with high degrees of inefficiency and have losses in the region of 30 to 40%. So we cannot have climate smart cities without efficient public services, and substantive reform of urban land markets to create more inclusive cities is a crucial first step. Second, looking at mixed use zoning. We've stayed within a paradigm of land use zoning that comes from the Victorian era, which is single use zoning. So you declare a parcel as either completely residential or completely commercial. But that's not the way cities have developed in history. They've developed on mixed use zoning, where you may have a shop and you live on top of the shop, or you may have commercial space at the ground level and say 4 levels of housing above that. Now we need to develop this assessing neighborhood context, and not through formulaic prescriptions like we've tended to do where we have adopted mixed use zoning. But mixed use zoning reduces the average trip distance between work and home, which reduces carbon footprint, which is what a climate smart city should do. The third is mixing transit modes. Looking at roads, actually we have a policy which says you should allocate road space by people rather than vehicles, but that's not what we do. So we have the current situation where private vehicles carry approximately 15% of the trips, but occupy 80% of the road space. Buses carry over 40% of trips and occupy less than 5% of road space. So we need to shift modes, more people on public transit to lower the carbon footprint. Now, you might say if we throw more buses onto the roads, that will create more congestion. But in a highly stratified society, which we are, you need a necessary amount of congestion before people shift from private to public transit. And then we need to look across all modes, road, rail, and also non-motorized transit like cycles and pedestrians. And that's the way we would reduce our carbon footprint of transit. We currently have a bias towards private vehicles, a knee-jerk reaction of flyovers as isolated projects rather than comprehensive strategies across all transit modes. Number 4 is ecological frameworks. There is a planning framework that actually rides on the issue of ecology, where there's a technique of mapping the city in terms of ecological features such as topography, water runoff, physical features, vegetation, soils. And then you use these maps to determine how one can locate development with minimum disruption to existing ecosystems. Now, this technique is unused in India and is essential for climate resilience. Ecological goals also push you towards decentralization in a hierarchy of scales, because many crucial issues like water recharge and harvesting, waste management, renewable energy work best when decentralized effectively at neighborhood or ward levels. Fifth is urban block prototypes. We see our cities in terms of two prototypes, either the individually owned villa or workplace within its own plot of land, or multiple ownerships in mid-rise or high-rise towers containing apartments or offices. Both of these prototypes have buildings isolated within setbacks and surrounded by a compound wall. Again, not how cities are traditionally developed. Usually, traditional cities have what's called a perimeter block, where the building form hugs the street edge without setbacks, containing a sheltered courtyard within. Those familiar with Mumbai, Ballard Estate and Nariman Point have close to the same building density in built-up area per acre. But Nariman Point has the tower prototype, whereas Ballard Estate has a perimeter block. Now, the perimeter block not only creates more vibrant street life, but actually buildings with setbacks separated by compound walls, the setback tends to be paved. So we have higher impermeable surfaces when we have the tower prototype or the single owner prototype. Whereas the perimeter block, because of its sheltered courtyard, creates permeable surface, more permeable surface where rain can percolate into the ground and recharge aquifers. So we both reduce the risk of flash floods and we reduce the heat island effect. Number 6 is energy-based building codes. We need to bring mandatory standards on energy performance into building codes. We do have a national guideline standard, but very poor implementation at the municipal level. Now, there are two aspects of energy. One is operating energy, how much energy is taken in keeping the building functioning. And the other is embodied energy, how much energy goes into the materials that constitute the building. And we have very poor databases in India on embodied energy. We should actually have law that makes suppliers of building materials mandatorily certify how much embodied energy the material has. And 7th is the issue of the public realm. A sociologist called Ray Oldenburg came up with this wonderful formulation of what he called the third place. All of us have a first place of home, a second place of work, and a third place where we go to build community. Now, these might be buildings such as coffee houses and community halls, or there may be landscapes such as chowks, parks, playgrounds, maidans. Our city plans are making lower and lower allocations to third place, which are also declining due to a host of other reasons. And the public realm is getting restricted to the functions of movement, consumption, and recreation. Now, this assumes a passive and disaggregated citizenry. We need to build more third places as a conscious strategy. And I'm not arguing that this will make us all one happy family, but even the best strategy for climate resilience will not work without a threshold level of community participation and support. And the way the urban public realm builds social cohesion is critical. So to conclude, I'd just like to say this is a crucial century for India. For the first time in our very long history, by the middle of the century, the urban population will outnumber the rural population. A major portion of this growth will happen outside metropolitan cities in tier 2, tier 3 cities and areas currently classified as rural that will transform to being urban. So both, whether it's climate resilience, the wider issue of social equality, of just urban life in general, how we imagine, plan, and operate the Indian city will determine whether we sink or swim as a country. And I'm afraid we are currently not on the right track.
Thanks, Prem. In fact, I saw a question from Suresh Venkat who says that he has heard that cities tend to be economically and more energy efficient at the end of the day. And consequently, should we be focusing climate change efforts in villages? And so that's something we'll come to later. That's a point of view that Suresh Venkat mentions. But for me, and I know it's also our inherent biases, for me, the key takeaway really is that 50% of the people are outside our planning paradigm. So the way we do master plans, the land use, zonal regulations are really outdated. And you mentioned a thing called Victorian era. Appropriately, when it comes to mobility, we have something which is still with us called the Stage Carriage Act. And that's something we'll come to as when we discuss mobility later. Moving on to our next panelist, Ashwin Mahesh is a long-term friend and fellow traveler in this space. What many in the room and in the city are likely to know Ashwin, but I don't know how many of you know that he started his life as a climate scientist. He actually spent 6 months in the Arctic. He tells me he was doing climate research there. I think he went there to spot polar bears. He wears a lot of hats. I mean, he's a social technologist, climate scientist, urbanist, but I mean, also involved in politics and systemic reform and governance and the like. Two things, Ashwin, as I ask you to speak. You used two things. One is you are the one who introduced me to the Keeling curve. When you mentioned Keeling curve to me, I headed for Google. So you need to tell us what is the Keeling curve, because 90% of the room does not know what it is. And second, you also used a very interesting term that while we use terms like sustainability and the like, we should really be talking about accelerating sustainability. Help us understand what do you mean by that. Ashwin?
Yeah. Thanks, Ravi. The Keeling curve, just to get that out of the way, is the measurement of atmospheric carbon dioxide in parts per million by volume, which has sort of been a number that's been put out since the middle of the last century. And it sort of documents how we are continuously loading the atmosphere with more and more carbon dioxide. And it sort of takes its name from the scientist who was first involved in documenting it. It's a measurement made at the Mauna Loa Observatory or somewhere in Hawaii, in one of these observatories, hilltop observatories in Hawaii. And it's a good place to make that measurement because it's sort of an uncontaminated place in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And carbon dioxide is a well-mixed gas, so it doesn't concentrate in one part of the atmosphere. So what you measure in a place like Mauna Loa is really indicative of the global average in some way. With that out of the way, and with Prem having sort of laid out the framework for a lot of interventions that are needed, I thought I would take a different tack in talking here. 30 years ago, I was a climatology grad student, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC that Ankit referred to, had just been set up a couple of years before I started my PhD. And one of my department professors, Conway Leowy, was on the IPCC. He was one of the earliest members. And I watched the work of the IPCC quite carefully over all these years. And at some point, I began to realize that this thing is totally missing the connection between what we are learning from the scientific community and the action that needs to happen as a result of it. For 30 years, we have known the problem. But even worse than that, for 30 years, we have known the solutions too, and yet we did not do anything to actually overcome the problem that we are facing in climate change. And one could say the same thing about COVID too. Pandemic warnings are not recent. They've been around for a while. All sorts of people, not just epidemiologists, but others have also said that if you ever get hit by a virus like this thing, the damage that it causes, not only to public health, but also to the economy could be substantial. But we didn't heed those warnings either. I want to talk a little bit about why that is. I think there are three fallacies that all of us live with. The first fallacy is to say nothing bad will happen. Right? I mean, we don't wear our helmets. We do things that are marginally risky here and there. We cross the street without sometimes looking left or right. We do things that are potentially risky. But we say, oh, nothing bad will happen. We say that all the time. We also say, the second fallacy, is that nothing bad will happen to me. So even if somebody were to point out, well, accidents do happen, you sort of continue your line of thinking by saying, yeah, I recognize that accidents happen, but I'm going to tell myself that they don't happen to me. And the third fallacy is to say that nothing so bad will happen to me that I can't recover from it. So there are three levels of fallacies. Nothing bad will happen, nothing bad will happen to me, and nothing so bad will happen to me that I can't recover from it. We live with this mix all the time in different aspects of our life. And after a while, that's really a framework for a lot of things that we do. And then there's the social and the political element, right? We have this idea that we must do something to confront this really large problem. But we also have an internalized sense that this need not be done by me. Somebody should do something, correct, but that somebody is not me. Maybe Narendra Modi should do something. Maybe the United Nations should do something. The WHO should do something. Generally, even my neighbor should do something. It's just not me. There's a lot of that externalization of the problem as well. And then comes the political system. I know Rajiv's listening, but we'll take him as an exception to what I'm about to say now. We look around at the guy, we say, oh, who's supposed to do something? The political class that represents us. And then we look at them and say, these guys, they're not going to be able to do anything. So in a sense, not only have we externalized the problem, we now find that we have externalized it to a set of people that who we ourselves believe cannot solve this problem. So you've actually got into a social and political problem. This is not a technical and managerial problem. It's not an administrative matter. It's not a law and governance matter. It's actually a social and political reality. So now let's talk about what is it going to take? Obviously, if the Sarkar cannot solve this problem by itself, you have to say, what are the other pieces? The conventional, way of thinking about it, which can work, is to say there is the state, there is the market, and there is society. All three have to play a part. And all three have to begin to play their respective parts without waiting for the others, which means companies have to do something, people like you and I in society have to do something, and then we can expect Sarkar also to do something. All three have to go together. Now, what is this resilience? Broadly, you can think of resilience as anticipating things that can go wrong, being able to withstand them when they go wrong, and then being able to recover from whatever has gone wrong. You need all these things. You sort of, prepare, and when it hits you, you somehow withstand it, and then after it's gone, you come back from it quickly. This is the thing that you can broadly speak of as resilience. But this kind of resilience results from habits and systems. It doesn't, unless your habits and systems are in place, you can't really get to this kind of resilience. It's not a programmatic thing. It's not about this law and that framework and so on and so forth. It's really about having the habits and systems that add up to this. What is it that we can do specifically to build this resilience? And this is the thing that I sent you this white paper on, and you can share that if that's possible. But essentially, I'm saying what we need to do is stop talking about what should be done and focus a lot more on getting more and more things done. And these are two different things. This is not to say that talking about sustainability is not important. Of course, talking about sustainability is important, but accelerating sustainability adoption is even more important. Even if you did not talk about sustainability and focused on adopting sustainable practices, you would still be contributing to the solution, whereas talking alone is not going to be helping. So what does it mean to accelerate sustainability? Some years ago, I wrote a white paper about this and identified 5 things that we can do to accelerate sustainability adoption. And if we accelerate the adoption of sustainability, we'll find that we are getting to the habits and systems that give us resilience. The 5 things are: first, we must have information and advocacy. We must tell people again and again what they can do to become champions of sustainability and resilience themselves. And we must do it in context. It's not just about saying build homes that are, from local materials, or build homes with this or that, build homes in this style or that style. But it's about doing it in context. Imagine when you apply to the municipality or BDA for a building plan approval, along with the approval, they give you a list of places and people from whom you can source materials and ideas to build sustainably. In that context, a lot more people will do it. Without that context, they're hearing the information in ways that they can't act on. The second thing is we must have law and governance. And Prem has already detailed a fair number of things that would many of which could be broadly captured under law and governance. Anu listed a few things as well. We have to have the law and governance framework for some of this. The third thing we need is a pipeline of innovations. You have to keep coming up with new stuff that really can be adopted by lots of people and turned into things that contribute to the acceleration of sustainability. It can be really simple. If you just put in an aerator in the 3 big faucets in your house, in the kitchen, maybe in your bathroom sink, maybe, and maybe even in the shower. If you did these 3 things alone, you would reduce the water consumption dramatically. We should just simply say, do this in every house in the city. And if you did that, you'd find a very different profile of water consumption. And this kind of pipeline of innovations in water, waste, energy, mobility, there are multiple infrastructure. There are 4 or 5 sectors in which we need to constantly keep coming up with innovations and constantly ask, how do we get these innovations adopted by more and more people? The fourth thing we need to do is invest in businesses of the future. Venture capital firms are starting to do this stuff, but we need more and more people to invest in businesses of the future. We need the sarkar to enable that. We need private capital to enable that. We need ordinary people even to figure out at micro scale what they can do. We need microfinance institutions to think about this as well. We simply need to say, if we invest in businesses that are doing things the right way, they will eventually become the dominant businesses in their respective sector. And the last thing, which is really important, is that we need an element of proving by doing. A lot of people believe that the future will be better, but they seem to believe it about the future. They don't seem to believe it about the present. A lot of stuff that we think will happen only in the future is in fact doable today. And if we demonstrate that, then more people will adopt that as well. And I look at some of what we did with lithium and the electric cars as a kind of example of that. But like I said, all of this stuff needs to be a baseline. When the normal existence of our lives includes all these 5 things, we will be resilient automatically and won't need a program developed specifically for resilience.
Thank you for that, Ashwin. There's something that I'd like, I remember when the Rockefeller Foundation came to India a few years ago, they had this 100 Resilient Cities program, and they had a challenge getting Indian cities to understand what resilience is. Maybe we should ship across your points on resilience to many of the Indian cities, saying you need to plan and make it happen. And maybe you could be the chief resilience officer for the country.
Well, Rockefeller left, as you know. They gave up trying to convince me. Yeah.
In fact, now we have, Ashwin's 5 points, Prem's 7 points on urban planning. There's a lot to unpack there. I now want to come to our last speaker before we get to the discussion, and that would be Rajiv Chandrasekhar. Sorry, Rajiv Gowda. The advantage of, I knew Rajiv when he was a public policy professor at IIM Bangalore, well before he got into politics. And the advantage of knowing a politician before they get into politics is he takes your calls even after he becomes a politician. Today, I have an ask of you, Rajiv. And the ask is very simple. Ashwin is really saying that, he kept saying Sarkar, he used words like Sarkar as enabler, etc. You've heard these people speak. I know you also have views on this whole issue because you're a public policy professional yourself. But today I want you to don more the political hat, saying how do politicians, whether it be center, state, local, how do they see this issue of climate change? Is it in their consideration set? How do they see this as a looming challenge to be solved? And where are we on the politics of trying to fix this issue proactively, as opposed to reactive? Rajiv.
Thanks, Ravi. And I have one way of explaining my name by saying, Rajiv and Gowda. Basically, there are two prime ministers' names in mine. And then Rajiv Chandrasekhar, my colleague, said, "Hey, there are two prime ministers' names in mine too." So we couldn't really distinguish between that. So this is a common mistake that happens, but we're very, very different, both in terms of our approaches and, of course, in terms of our, wealth levels, I suppose. But anyway, the issue that you're raising, how do politicians see this problem? It's one about priorities. And the priorities today are about development pressures, are about inflows of people into cities. It's not just the big metros, but also the tier 2, the tier 3 cities. In every taluk headquarter, every district headquarter, you see tremendous inflow and growth. Now, the growth is also being fueled in some kind of a decentralized manner by people who are developing layouts, people who are then converting agricultural land and creating revenue layouts, as they're called. And in the process, the entire ecosystem is being transformed. If you, my father used to be Speaker of the Assembly, and I used to listen to people coming and telling him, we need a new bus stand. Let's take that lake on the outskirts of the city, drain it, and convert it into a bus stand. So there's always pressure to turn what are essentially commons into some other kind of land use. And as cities grow, that pressure will continue. Now, this is continuing to happen, in Bangalore City. You see that we took an ecosystem that was relatively well balanced with its ecology. The chain tank systems that ensured that water supply was available to us over hundreds of years, and we destroyed that. And then we said we'll pump water up from the Kaveri River to Bangalore City, losing any connect with our own responsibility for rainwater harvesting, for groundwater recharge, any of these sorts of things. And then, of course, we just pump our waste out into the Rishabhavati and other systems and not worry about what happens to it all. So this, and right now we're facing challenges where we have this luxury of having a national park on the outskirts, and there's a lot of pressure to reduce the buffer zone for Bannerghatta National Park. So pressures of development tend to put a lot of pressure on governments, on the kinds of policy measures, on what is allowed and what is overlooked after having broken the law. So a lot of that happens. Then if you take the profile of people who are able to contest and be part of the political system today, you will find that they're not your old lawyers and professors. There are actually people who are involved in this development activity through the creation of real estate, and therefore their own agendas are somewhat different. Now, that political economy tends to drive a lot of decision making, but at the same time, policymakers who are in the position of power, who are running the sarkar, as it were, are interested in delivering, are interested in demonstrating that they've been able to make some kind of a transformative impact on society, on the state, on development in different ways. And there, actually, many of them find that the knowledge and awareness of what all is happening, what all will happen as a result of today's actions, much of that is actually not available to them, or has already got frozen into some long-term development plan, which they're not in a position to undo, including zoning regulations, depending on when your term of office shows up. Now, much of this, of course, can change if we start improving awareness and advocacy about ecosystem services and their impact, how we are undervaluing them, and as a result, we will see a lot of other kind of needless expenditure because we're not really taking proactive action. Now, along with all this, there are measures that the governments have been taking. If it is something as simple as giving a discount for someone who installs a solar water heater, measures that are not implemented but which mandate rainwater harvesting. Many of these things are already there or can be enhanced. Change of planning where multiple pipelines for potable water and for reusable, recyclable water. These sorts of measures, if enforced, will make a huge difference to our ability to sustain our cities. But policymakers are aware when they see the floods that happen in a city like Bangalore, sitting on 3,000 feet above sea level, drained by some 7 valleys, and we still see people dying in floods when you have excess rain. You have issues of disease, all the new diseases that we never heard of growing up as children in Bangalore, chikungunya, dengue. All of these are a result of some combination of neglecting how urbanization is happening and what impact it's happening on the neighborhood. And of course, there are much larger connections that we need to pay attention to, which is the overall ecosystem. And that has to do with when we talk about Kaveri water. If we are not also paying attention to development pressures on Kodagu, then we are going to be facing a situation where suddenly the water in the Kaveri dries up, and you're going to see Bangalore being a city which does not have enough water to sustain itself. All this said, I will point out that there are quite a few policy measures that give me hope. One of them is the way people are now looking at, for example, water management, right? You already have citizen moves, citizen initiatives that have helped reclaim lakes. You have governmental initiatives that have prevented developers from taking over wetlands and building apartments there, and the green tribunals actions in this regard. You have if you look across the state, you have measures like the Ramthal Marol drip irrigation scheme, which is taking water conservation in a much more massive scale. And of course, Bangalore's connection now to the Kolar Chikballapur district system, where we're going to be treating the KC Valley water and pumping it upstream, and that's going to recharge essentially the chain tank system out there and ensure that the hinterland, which provides us our horticulture and vegetable products, that is actually going to be benefiting from the water that we are taking away from the Kaveri system in a very different riverine ecosystem out there. So basically, the range and scale of planning, that understanding needs to permeate into the consciousness of policymakers. I don't think that policymakers would want to go out there on some kind of self-destruction spree, because they too have longer-term visions and longer-term interests in staying alive and demonstrating that they are capable of changing the way things are going. But what Prem mentioned about planning and the nature of our urban planning, if we keep building 30, 40 sites and acquiring more and more land, rather than changing the way we build dense neighborhoods which are multi-use, and then if we have this inflow of people that we're not able to cope with through maybe rental housing, and we've just seen the crisis with migrant workers, we are going to be facing lots and lots of challenges ahead. But I would not despair about the political class. We're all there, and we want to engage and work together to change the trajectory going forward.
Thank you, Rajiv. Now, the other thing is, more importantly, you have a surname which strikes, does worry. You have a very strong surname, Rajiv, than anything else. The question, you said good watershed management, that's good to hear. And while I request my other panelists to switch on their videos and come online, Rajiv, there's a question I want to ask you. You're a member of parliament, and you know that the 74th Amendment is not working. And cities, there was a talk, I think Anu mentioned the point that cities need to be empowered. Is there any appetite for parliament in a bipartisan manner to say that, look, let's rethink? Because if India is going to double in its urban population by 2050, we definitely need an empowered third tier of city government. We have a constitutional defect of a local body where we should have had a local government. Is there even a remotest thinking of that kind? Is that something on the anvil? Or do we have to reckon that that governance measure from the center is not going to happen, and we got to work with this dysfunctional system to get the outcomes we want? Rajiv?
Ravi, I would say that actually the moment that we are passing through right now, the COVID-19 crisis has actually woken up people in policymaking circles to the need to have empowered local bodies with the ability to deliver healthcare, for example, in a manner that would really make an impact. So if ever there was a policy window for re-looking at this particular issue, I think that window has emerged now. And you're seeing that in the context of not just the health issue, but also the migrant crisis, migrant worker crisis that we're seeing. So, I am partly involved in my party's formulation of ideas in the context of responding to the crisis and reviving the economy after this. And this is certainly an issue that has cropped up. The challenge, of course, is that we have to recognize that the existing players in the system, the MLAs and the MPs, have often felt that if resources all flow to urban representatives or Panchayat Raj representatives, essentially, that they get frozen out of the ability to make an impact and control outcomes. And we've got to look for ways to balance out that political economic reality as well.
So we need to find a smart way to actually break that concern that definitely exists. So if I read between the lines, I'm just hoping that you will start piloting certain new transformative thinking in terms of how do we govern our cities, starting from the center that could flow down. You see, there's a question, and I'd like to take this to the panel. It's a question that 2 or 3 people have raised. I think KG Narayan I saw, I think Manuel Alur. There's a point being made that there's a carrying capacity for a city. And if we got to get this climate change right, we better not exceed this this carrying capacity. Rajiv spoke about periphery. Would any of the panelists like to address this issue that is carrying the importance of, and not that it's possible in the context of India to say this is the number, it's not China, but how would you address this question of we need to freeze the carrying capacity within inverted comma? So would you like to go with this? Ashwin, I think I'll throw this to you on the carrying capacity, and then I'll have Anu and Ankit respond to that.
So the quick thing is to be careful about that, because when you say there's a carrying capacity and there's a limit beyond which the city cannot grow, it automatically lends itself to a kind of exclusionary thinking, saying, we don't want any more new people. And you see this throughout California and places like that, where rich communities say, why should we add more housing? More housing just brings people who are non-rich into our wealthy communities. So we have to be careful about that. If we are going to have a freeze, I would come at it in a different way. The problem today is that unlike in most places in the world, in India, anybody with a piece of land can build on it. That's a bizarre thing. It's not like that's not the norm at all anywhere in the world, right? And also this interferes with your planning, because you now have a bunch of guys. One guy might come from Yelahanka and make an application today. Tomorrow somebody with Sarjapur Road will come. Some third day somebody from Bidadi comes and makes an application. The way built form develops in the city has to be guided by planning in clusters in specific geographies that have carrying capacity. If the southwest of the city has greater carrying capacity, then you have no business approving building plans for construction in the northeast of the city. So you have to take the approach that the approval process has to intervene in this thing. Okay. One other thing I wanted to, on the question you asked, Rajiv, the next delimitation is due in 7 years, the 2026. In 2026, the 84th Amendment sunsets. And at that point, when constituencies are delimited again, you will already have a parliament that is dominated by urban representatives at that point. And that's the opportunity.
So
in Karnataka,
that trend is your...
it's very interesting. In Karnataka, 6,000 villages are already empty. People are fleeing the villages, right? Now, actually, if you really want to take up a distributed development, even based on land acquisition, you might as well acquire the places that people are leaving rather than going around and trying to acquire places where people are continuing to live. You can build all these things all over the place. But better control over permissions on land is a key part of this.
Right. Prem, I'll come to you. I've noticed you raised your hand. Anu, you raised this whole issue. I mean, does Rajiv's answer on governance and that there might be readiness to look at it in the new COVID situation. Does that give you any hope? You have a politician on the panel, you can ask him a question about what he can. I mean, I'm a pretty influential one, so ask him what you want on the governance change, because that's an area that you have actually applied your mind quite a bit to, before I come to Ankit and Prem. Anu?
Thanks. No, I completely actually agree with you. I think a lot of people are seeing COVID as an opportunity wherein there can be sort of changes that can be put in place in terms of, what are you trying to achieve? A couple of things are very, very clear. One, you need sort of better health infrastructure, and can there be sort of systems wherein you have subnational governments that are trusted with sort of, governance mechanisms, but also finances in being able to carry out certain decisions. One of the questions I also see is about, local initiatives and are they actually redundant? The fact is you need to trust that there needs to be some global to local thinking. Adaptation solutions that work for one city need not work for another. Often when we think of just, and purely, this is now just disaster management response, right? The money is often sort of held and it's not distributed, because the idea is that if we hold it, you don't know, because you don't know when the disaster is going to strike, to what extent, in which district. But that kind of, it's a bit unbalanced, because you're seeing good examples in the US, for instance, where you've got these post 9/11 emergency response centers, as we were discussing earlier, which are now fundamentally actually being used for addressing disasters and extreme weather events. You have to trust that your city government, your local subnational government needs that kind of agency. If that kind of change in thinking can happen, that would be great. I would say what we're seeing on the ground, and I'm going to be a little bit sort of conservative here, is very much what Ankit spoke about. You have to find the hooks and opportunities when you do work. We often work with these kind of limitations. So, so it's really worth seeing that if there will be that kind of transformational change, at least in terms of giving away some sort of devolution of power and fiscal responsibility.
So essentially you're saying you're a votary that we are more likely to see incremental change, and transformative change might have to wait. I mean, at least in the near term, if I get you right. Ankit, before I come to you, Prem, you had raised your hand, and I also noticed Vijayan Menon has put a comment that in theory, I mean, at the end of the day, I think land masses are finite, but he makes the point that in theory, the carrying capacity is infinite, and what you need is a social infrastructure in place. And if you have that, you can keep systematically increasing carrying capacity. I think that's the point he makes. So, Prem, from the angle that you have viewed from those 7 points that you mentioned on city planning, and I also want you to address, because one of the areas that we have addressed very weakly is the social rental housing and how we need to think of social housing in a city context. So if you can combine these points and look at it and give us a sense of how we could manage a growing city with high inequity, lopsided development priorities, poor planning, how can that future city be climate resilient and climate smart? Prem? I think you need to unmute yourself, Prem.
First, to address the issue of carrying capacity, I agree with Ashwin that to put capacity limits will wind up being exclusionary. I think it's also a question about how we distribute that carrying capacity across a region. There's a theory in planning called central place theory, which says that each level in the hierarchy in settlements across a region acts as a central place for a set of other places. So the metropolitan city services, maybe 6 towns around it. Each of those services a set of tier 3 towns, and each of those a set of villages, etc. And you have to plan your investment and your development and spread it across the region, respecting that central place theory. What we do is we disregard that. Although we have studied and categorized settlements according to this, so we focus development on the metropolitan cities. And if we could spread it, it would be very different. The population density in the Netherlands as a country is the same as that of India. But there's a huge difference in peak densities, because the Netherlands spreads its population much more evenly across the country. So I think we need to look at carrying capacity from this regional planning point of view. Okay. Regarding social infrastructure, yes, I'll just illustrate that with one of the sort of fears that everyone has had with the recent pandemic is density. That density is the cause of infection. They look at the US and say New York City has the highest density, the highest rate of. But one of the cities which has most successfully coped with the pandemic is Hong Kong, and it's got probably one of the highest densities in the world. And it has done it because one of citizen awareness and two public health infrastructure. So definitely a lot of social infrastructure will support carrying capacity. I agree with that. Rental housing is a huge issue we need to look at. Part of it is a problem that because so much of the housing exists in the informal sector, that depresses rental levels, and that makes it an unviable proposition. But you cannot, you mentioned something that I'd written about earlier. Housing is a verb, it's not a noun. It's a process by which one improves life. So take, for example, a very common situation of a migrant coming to the city. Now, housing is always designed with this idea of nuclear families, but the migrant first might come as a single male. And then maybe a year later, he doesn't bring his wife and children. He brings his two brothers and a set of other male cousins, because this network of males can create a better economic foothold in the city. And then maybe it's only 4 or 5 years down the line, he actually brings his family. So what kind of housing would cater to that kind of a situation, the flexibility that the poor need so much? And we have to create this option of social housing, both for ownership and also for rental. And we need policy that drives that.
Thanks, Prem. Ankit, coming to you. I mean, first, of course, you need to tell us as to why New York did not handle it the way Hong Kong did with its high density. Help us understand that. The second is you're also, you come from a background of also through the energy channel into this climate change debate. And actually, the energy folks captured climate change ahead of the others. Even the Energy Resources Institute came through energy, and now, of course, people look at it from land use and a whole lot of other angles, but initially the prism. And there's a question from Prabha Chandra. So I'm actually bundling a whole range and throwing it to you, where Prabha says, it's all good to talk about green building and the like, but is it realistic for the poor to have those kind of, for you to have expectations that the poor will be able to afford those green buildings? And let's look at it from an energy footprint sense. Ankit, you need to unmute.
Yeah, wonderful. I'm not sure if I'm the best authority to speak about the particular conundrum in New York at the moment. I think what's happened here is actually just...
Do stay safe. Do stay safe.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, we can get into that a bit later. So there are a lot of things on the table right now. The thing on energy is an important one, right? You're right to point out that the energy sector has been internalizing and thinking about reducing carbon emissions quite a lot. And the big thing that has actually changed is the fact that renewable costs have actually dropped significantly since 2010, right? In 2010, it was about, I think, 10 to 12 rupees per kilowatt hour per unit to produce from solar panels. Now you can get solar energy at about 2 to 3 rupees per unit, right? This is a significant shift, and it creates huge opportunities, not only for private businesses, but also governments to think about how can we bring together solar panels into our everyday lives, right? So the first point is that these things are getting cheaper, which means that potentially there can be ways and schemes to make things more accessible for the poor. Right. One scheme that I've personally followed and tracked is something like the Ujwala LED scheme. This was a scheme that provided very subsidized LED bulbs that cuts your energy consumption by 90%. This was a very successful scheme, in my opinion. It was done through where you pay the bill, and they would give you information about you can buy this bulb on a subsidy and you can EMI it on your bill. A lot of the poor households that I surveyed in Rajkot availed this technology, and most of them actually had LED bulbs. So there are opportunities like that, and we can actually extend that scheme to things like energy efficient fans, solar panels potentially, etc. Now, just quickly on carrying capacity. Now, I personally think that this would be an issue if we had sewage treatment, if we had waste management, if we had equitable housing for everybody in Indian cities, if we had public transport for everybody. Now, if we have all these things in place, and still we're facing ecological issues, we're still facing, crises of flooding or pollution, etc., then perhaps we can have a conversation about carrying capacity. But we haven't even put the basic critical infrastructure in place. And that's why I'm very glad that Dr. Gowda brought up the fact that politicians are now thinking about how they can enable cities and build up their infrastructure. In my view, we actually need a new eco-social contract, right? We need a new way to think about what are we going to be providing to citizens? What do they deserve? Because we know that without providing services, we will all be in a collective storm together without helping each other out.
Thanks, Ankit. Rajiv, Ankit mentioned about the Ujwala scheme. There's a desire for the central government to come with what is called the centrally sponsored schemes as a way saying that this is something that is coming from Delhi to the local areas, etc. Politically, I think it makes sense at one level. But my point to you is this always going to be the way that it is centrally thought through and sent across? Or will we ever get to a stage where we decentralize? Because what the other thing that COVID has taught is the answer lies in decentralization and deeper decentralization, as we have seen in Kerala and other places, to respond. And the closer you are to the problem and the issue, the better you're a judge whether this particular product or that particular product or solution is required. So I want you to wear your political hat and to say that, and you already mentioned that they're not willing to let go because they won't have control over the funds. But how do we make that happen if you buy into the construct that a big part of the answer lies in deeper decentralization, local governments and the like? Rajiv?
Thanks, Ravi. So, Ravi, our friend Ashwin is here, and he's often talking about public problem solving and about innovation in terms of policy ideas. And Ankit just mentioned about the the lowering of the costs of renewable technology and things like that. Now, if you fly in the old airport, we would fly over the city to land in HL airport, you'd see solar water heaters on every roof, right? So basically, what has happened with that technology today in Karnataka during the Siddaramaiah government, you had the idea of solar water pumps, okay, and a program called Surya Raita, where you could actually be a farmer using some of your land for for generating renewable energy and then feeding it back into the grid. So much of this technology is developing as we speak. Now, but this innovation is something that is not being part of some centrally sponsored scheme. It can be integrated with a smart resilient cities program or something like that, of course. But the basic point is that once the convergence happens between cost and technology and innovation, then this becomes an idea that can then spread across the country. So basically what we need is a lot more emphasis on how do we do this? How do we do rainwater harvesting in a manner that would actually work and lower your bills as your water bills, or maybe even if you're feeding water somehow back into the system, then that you're going to get some kind of a credit, right? So these are just examples that I'm tossing out where the innovation has not come from the center, but there are lots of these ideas floating around possibly, but they need to be connected, implemented, demonstrated, and shared. And the last point I wanted to mention is that when political leaders want to leave a legacy, the Prime Minister, came up with a change in the title of the name of the ministry. It's not just environment and forest; it's environment, forest, and climate change. Right now, he's probably eager for some good slogan-driven program that would go out and take that climate change idea and translate that into action on the part of people and governments across the country. So that would be a centrally inspired program. But that doesn't, but basically what I'm trying to say is that he's cottoned on to the idea that something needs to be done. What fills that up is the real challenge. But that is out there, depending on different local ecosystems, geographies, and things like that. But certainly the planning process and how that develops, and which has a very different time scale than the terms of office of elected officials, a lot of these, we need to find ways to bring some congruence between them.
First of all, I mean, on climate change, I think India has been a very responsible nation. I mean, even if you look at Paris Accord, etc., the kind of steps that we have taken at a national level, Of course, there's a whole debate and we don't have the time for it on developing nations, developed nations, and the path to be followed. I just want to switch track and ask about a question that's worrying me, which is linked to climate change in cities, public transport and mobility. The thing about COVID, and there is a question in terms of electric vehicles. We have Ashwin here who runs Lithuania, right? He's spotted the right business in a certain sense. But on public transport, with it likely to come back later, 1/3 of the capacity, and we know that if we go down the private vehicle road, the carbon emissions are going to increase significantly because electric may not kick in at the rate that it needs to kick in. And consequently, it's going to be a setback to the greenhouse gases. So how would you address this challenge that COVID has posed to the use of public transport, which is one of the mode? Why are we not thinking of more walking, cycling? And conceptually, why can't we think of more live and work clusters within what I've in the past said, 4 to 5 kilometer neighborhoods at mixed use, mixed income? So Ashwin, you also have your hand up. So can you take this question before I go to the others?
See, I think the adoption of cleaner energy, and more and more things being possible as a result of that clean energy, it's on a reasonable track. The problem is actually with vehicle development. It's not so much with the energy issue itself. If they lifted the import tariffs on electric vehicles, you would get 200,000 vehicles next year itself. So there is that to one side. But I would come back to saying that what is the problem we are trying to solve? The problem we are trying to solve cannot be pollution itself or congestion itself. There is an equity problem in all of this thing, right? Fundamentally, people are spending way too much of their money getting to a place of work and back, and therefore what they are earning is diminished by the very act of getting to a place and back. If we treat that as the thing to be tackled, then you might conclude that it's all right for people to travel slightly longer distances if it is affordable and clean. The density is important. Density just does reduce dramatically the cost of infrastructure. So I'm generally in favor of density. But I don't think we need to say we have a large metropolitan area and we've got to figure out how many things are possible in that metropolitan area for this work and live experience. And my gut feeling also, Ravi, and we can discuss this more sometime, I think only 30% of the people have the kind of jobs that would ever allow them to live within walking distance or cycling distance of their place of work. So I think we mustn't put
but at the same time, as I mentioned earlier a week ago, superheroes don't drive to work. So you need to find a solution where they are driven to work.
Exactly. Essentially, the point is getting them affordably and cleanly to their workplaces. And in India in particular, less than 20% of the people have a fixed workplace. Our Bangalore experience is actually a kind of an exception to all of these things. A lot of people move around a lot during the city. I don't know if you remember the stuff that we did with the mobile towers 10 years ago. They would shift all over the place. Very few people were going to one neighborhood and coming back, going in the morning, coming back in the evening, and maybe with IT that happens. But a lot of other people were not doing that at all. And we need to be cognizant of that when we come up with this idea of live and work. In a factory, that's just not possible. In a manufacturing environment, that's not possible, right?
Though we historically had the public sector units that were built with that at the heart of it. Moving on.
And look where those public sector companies are now.
Just moving on, one last question before I get closing comments. There is a question from Lakshmi Venkatachalam. Basically, she asks the question, how do we retrofit a tier 1 city, which is already badly built, and how do we rectify that? So Ankit, I'm noticing that you're nodding your heads vigorously. So Ankit, if you have any points on that, or Prem, the architect come urban planner, how do you retrofit a city that's gone awry? Yeah, Prem. Unmute, please, unmute. Yeah.
I think the biggest impact is looking at governance, more effectively implementing the 74th Amendment, and that would have a huge impact. Like Rajiv just mentioned, the problem of water management. What do we have in Bangalore? We have water supply and sewerage handled by the BWSSP and stormwater runoff handled by the BBMP, and the two don't talk to each other. So there's no capacity to look at the water cycle in its entirety.
That's true. And neither do we have proper watershed management. We tend to do a point solution in Belandur.
Watershed management.
Larger watershed.
There's a case that on waste management that went to the High Court, and the High Court actually forced the government to create ward committees, which they've done nothing about for over 20 years, because it was realized that at the decentralized ward level, you could most effectively do waste management. So it's really governance, and if there's a will to fix it, it's relatively easy to fix, and that would have the biggest impact.
Yeah, I know some of us have spent a lot of time writing reports on it, which nobody reads. Ankit, do you want to add anything on retrofitting a city?
Yeah. I agree with Prem. I think that governance is the issue. What I also want to point out is that when we look around, we actually see a lot of instances of retrofitting, right? People are always incrementally improving their homes, changing their homes. Things like solar water heaters on top of rooftops have significantly reduced the heating load. There are things we can do like that, right? An example that I often think about is Google, when they moved into India and they got all this Google map data, they actually realized that Indians tend to move a lot within their neighborhood as well, right? For their groceries, etc. Yes, there are migrants and economic commuters that take very long trips, but a lot of these shorter trips are also prevalent and dominate India's transport. And a big shift in Delhi especially has been the fact that these e-rickshaws have now come out, right? E-rickshaws have really changed the landscape of how people move within their neighborhoods. And the amount of e-rickshaws that are there in Delhi actually rival the amount of e-vehicles that are there in China as well. So my point is that we have to think of creative ways by which we can already increment and change existing economies of transport, building, construction. One way of doing that is to make lithium-ion batteries cheaply available to people who manufacture buses and autos, right? There are small auto workshops in each of our cities. If we make lithium-ion batteries available, they will be able to jerry-rig, their autos to have these clean technologies in them. The second thing is to make solar panels cheap to install in your home. I have a colleague, Mary-Helen Zara, who does some field work in rural Haryana, and she's investigating how even in villages, people, because of rebates they're getting from the discoms, are able to put up solar panels. These are all opportunities that really are able to think we can think creatively of the ways that which we can retrofit. And I think there are a lot of low-hanging fruit there.
Thanks, Ankit. For some time, you'll have to see, I think, Anu, so here's, as we're coming into closing, Anu, what I'd like you to cover, and all the other panelists, 1 minute closing thoughts on climate smart cities, and what's the one or two things that you would push for. So Anu, the point you wanted to make, your summary in terms of what is it that you would really peg, the one or two things you would peg your hat on to get to a climate smart resilient city. Anu?
Thank you. I think to answer this question as well, in thinking about tier one cities, I think critically when you think about physical impacts of climate change, I don't think we really have a choice. We do need to retrofit because you are going to see extreme sort of events happening and the city is not going to cope. So there is some work that's happening on the structural built environment in terms of how you can retrofit in terms of box culverts for roadways, for bridges, having the right camber. I mean, we are pushing against some massive rent seeking as well when you think about road infrastructure, when you think about drainage infrastructure, but these things need to be done. You're already seeing cities. I mean, I'm amazed at the kind of work, for instance, cities like Dhaka do, because, perennial flooding, really thinking about, okay, what are we doing with our floodplains? How are we getting the natural environment back? So there's certainly ways you can put in place. And I think for me, closing thoughts would be, and this is a conversation we've had for a while, and this is something I talk about, even whether it's at the state level of the city, there needs to be a very explicit articulation of what the city is trying to get to, politically, economically, financially, and socially, both macroeconomically and microeconomically. And then how does climate sit on all of that, right? Both in terms of whatever decision you're taking, whether you're thinking about solar water in sort of each home, rainwater harvesting in each home, or you're thinking of just stopping building on floodplains, whatever you're doing for groundwater conservation, what are the motivations for this? Economic, financial, social, environmental, but also then thinking about what this means for long-term climate impacts. And what does it mean in terms of a low carbon transition as well? So there needs to be a very explicit conversation about this. You may not always get the right answers, right? You're always experimenting, but you're at least articulating the reasons why these are being put in place. And you already have a city that's thinking about this in a more vocal way, rather than having these sort of implicit motivations for why things are happening. Because you need to think about, if I have a rupee for every time people told me there was a transactional problem for why resilience could not be put in place, right? And these are the things you need to think about. Why is the state spending all of its climate money on a state climate plan on just roads? Because it's built by contractors. And there is an absolute mechanism in place for why there will be money that will be shifted. Let's put this out there, because then you decide how you build sustainably.
Thanks, Anu. Ashwin, would you like to go next in terms of your closing thoughts? Unmute yourself. Unmute Ashwin.
So here, there you go. Given that I said that it's primarily a social and political problem rather than a technical and managerial problem, the simplest thing that every single person can do is call all three elected representatives, your MP, your MLA, and your corporator, and tell them, I care about these three things. If you don't work on these three things, I'm never going to vote for you again in your life. So you have to make it clear that your support for this governance system that emerges is contingent on things that you care about. And I guarantee you, if you take that step, they'll listen to you. And until you take that step, they'll not listen to you.
Thanks. So basically put pressure on your elected rep. Prem, your closing thoughts.
For closing thoughts, I'd like to club two questions I've seen. One which says that if climate change is a global problem, are local actions meaningless? And the second saying, what can we do to change awareness at the school level? And basically, climate is a complex and non-linear system, which means that inputs and outputs don't have a direct relationship. And those systems evolve from the bottom up, and they have a capacity for emergence. That is, local interactions, a new quality emerges. Now we need to change our mindset to realize that's the way we naturally live. It's not the way we're trained. We're not the way we're schooled. We're schooled in linear logic. But say if a friendship group, it comes up through emergence, just through local interactions. And it's a fundamental property that didn't exist earlier. So we need to change our mindset and start realizing that the power that we can also live adaptive, sort of non-linear lives, and that can actually have huge change at the larger impact, more than actually top-down systems. And at the school level, to build a greater awareness of nature and look at the visibility of the complete range of nature. So if I take water, when Bangalore drew water from open wells and tanks, they were great communicators. If you drew too much water, you saw the water level dropping. Now, so much of the water system is rendered invisible in pumps and pipes. And so create awareness about the entire system and build that kind of awareness, the awareness of nature at a sensorial level also. We tend to judge things just visually. I think that if we start teaching at the school level could have a huge long-term impact.
Thanks, Prem. Ankit, your closing thoughts.
Yeah, so 70% of the world's energy is being consumed in cities, right? So these provide a deep opportunity for change. And I just want to kind of say that often, rather than kind of rethinking how we do our things, I think we need to think about how we can do better what we already do, right? How can we build housing better? How can we provide transport better? And I think the coronavirus crisis, though it has really caused societal upheaval, it's a real time to rethink what Indian cities can do and what politicians can do for them. And I hope that they do.
Thanks, Ankit. Rajiv, as the politician, you get the last word.
Thank you, Ravi. Well, it's been an amazing set of ideas that have been exchanged here this evening. And I would end by focusing once more on ecosystem services that are provided by nature wherever cities are located and in their geographies, and and if you take it at a different scale, when we're drawing, as I mentioned, Bengaluru from the Kaveri ecosystem, right? And then, of course, now we're taking our treated wastewater to a very different Palar ecosystem as well. So obviously, I think if there's more awareness of what damage will be caused by unthinking action, by planning that is short-sighted and not respectful of ecosystems, then you end up with the kind of situation that we find ourselves in. But there's enough knowledge around, and there's enough concern every year when we see floods or droughts or other crises. When newspaper headlines say after Cape Town, it's going to be Bangalore that's going to dry up, then people are concerned. And then I think we need to find mechanisms to work with planning authorities, ensure that the nature of how we let our cities grow will change, that we bring in the transport infrastructure, such as that elusive suburban rail, that would suddenly make it more worthwhile to be able to live 30 kilometers outside rather than in here, because it's still just a half-an-hour commute. And you get probably cleaner air and better schools and who knows what else out there. So there is, we are on the cusp of some dramatic change. And I think policymakers will be looking to advocate this and make it their legacy. That's the hope that I have.
Thanks, Rajiv. And actually, I think that the underlying point there really is, and I think there was a question to that effect, that we need to respect nature's lines. We cannot go against what the contours and the lines, etc. If we are respectful and mindful of that as we develop our cities. And I think there have been some great points even in the closing. Do better what we do currently. Can we do that better? Can we change the mindset, be more demanding of the elected reps, and all this within an overarching governance framework, which allows us to, for cities to determine their own destiny. Thank you, Ankit, Anu, Ashwin, Prem, and Rajiv. Thank you, attendees in the room and on YouTube. Thank you so much for being here. See you in a short while. Keep watching our websites and mailers for future events and announcements. We have 2 events coming up on Saturday. And when we are able to open, which might be many weeks and months away, there's a state of housing exhibition already installed at BIC, for which we are hoping to get people come and see the state of housing exhibition. And the heart of that exhibition is actually low-cost social rental housing. The exhibition is built around that. But for that, we need to get back, maybe many weeks away. See you then. Thank you so much and good night. And good morning, Ankit.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.